Hello and welcome to our online Pastor's Bible Study for July 1st, 2020. Last week, as a part of our Songs of Summer Sermon series, we looked at a song in a collection of songs called the Songs of Ascent, which are found in Psalms 120 through Psalm 134. These songs were sung by the ancient Israelites when they would make their pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the three great Jewish festivals every year: Passover, Pentecost, and the Tabernacle or Feast of the Tabernacles. Psalm 121 was the second song of ascent, which is the one that we read, and it was a reminder that God was with them always, even in the midst of a dangerous journey. Today we're going to be reading from another smaller collection of songs from the book of Isaiah that are called the Servant Songs. There are four of these servant songs, and you might want to write these down. It'd be nice if you could see them all, if you could read them all. We're only going to be talking about one of them, but they can be found in Isaiah 42, 1 through 4. That's the first. Isaiah 49, 1 through 6. Isaiah 50, 4 through 9 is the third. And the most famous one of them all is the one that we're going to be looking at, is Isaiah 52, beginning at verse 13, and it goes through Isaiah 53, verse 12. So again, let me go over those again. Isaiah 42, 1 through 4, Isaiah 49, 1 through 6, Isaiah 50, 4 through 9, and Isaiah 52, 13 through Isaiah 53, 12. And this last one is called the Song of the Suffering Servant. And it has been interpreted by the church as a prophecy of Jesus, really from the very beginning of the church, maybe even before that. In fact, as I'm going to share in my sermon today, I believe that this was one of Jesus' favorite songs growing up in the synagogue in Nazareth, and probably helped shape his identity and help him to understand his role as Messiah. Now again, I'm guessing on that, but he would have most definitely been familiar with these songs. And so of all the songs in the Bible, the Song of the Suffering Servant has had more of an impact probably than just about any other. It's not an exaggeration to say that all four Gospels are essentially a commentary on this song, on Isaiah 52 and 53. The Suffering Servant song is quoted about 85 times in the New Testament, referenced in some way. You may even remember one of the most famous places is found in the book of Acts, chapter 8, verses 26 through 40. In that story, there's an Ethiopian eunuch who is riding in his chariot, and he's on his way back to Egypt, and he's reading this prophecy. He's reading Isaiah 53, and he's reading about the one who suffers for our sin, and he's confused about who that might be. And he's looking for some direction, and so God sends the apostle Philip to help the Ethiopian eunuch to understand that Isaiah 53 really is a prophecy of Jesus. And so Philip comes alongside of him, and he walks him through the whole story, and he explains to Philip, or to the eunuch, that this is in fact describing Jesus, this suffering servant. And at the end of the story, it says that the eunuch asks to be baptized. And the two find some water, and Philip baptizes him right there on the spot. Great story. In terms of Israel's own history, this particular song comes from late in the Babylonian exile. Now, back in March and April, we read a lot of passages from this time in Israel's history. You may remember that Israel was taken into exile. Their temple was destroyed in around 598 BC. Isaiah 52 and 53 was written before the end of the exile, so late in the exile. And the end of the exile happened about 60 years later in 538 BC, and it was at that time that the people were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple by the Persian emperor, whose name was Cyrus. Well, needless to say, by this time, Israel had been humbled by their suffering. They weren't the proud people that they had once been. And Isaiah imagined now one who would take all of the people's sins upon himself and suffer vicariously for the salvation of all. As you'll see as we read these verses, it's not hard for us to see Jesus in really every single verse of this beautiful song. So we're going to begin at Isaiah 52, verse 13. And as I usually do, I'm going to be pausing between verses to share with you some of the things that I've learned in my studies this week. So Isaiah writes, "See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high." Now the first question that scholars will often ask of a text like this is, who is speaking? And most scholars agree that here at the beginning it is God who is speaking. The next question, of course, is who is the servant that he's describing? Now there are a lot of ideas about this. Some people believe that Isaiah may have been describing the Persian Emperor Cyrus or his son Darius that took over the job after him. After all, Cyrus is described in Isaiah 44 as God's anointed shepherd. It's the same word we use for Messiah. On the other hand, many Jewish rabbis would likely, even today, describe Israel itself as the suffering servant, because everything Israel suffered was so that the world might know about the power of God. Kind of see how that could make sense. And when you consider the fact of all of the suffering that they've experienced through history, including the Holocaust, that makes a lot of sense too. But most Christians clearly see Jesus suffering on the cross in these verses and believe he is the suffering servant being described here. And I think it's also probable that Jesus saw himself in this song. Whoever the servant was or is, the promise of this verse is that he will prosper, that he will accomplish that which he set out to do. Israel says that the servant will be exalted and lifted up. And those are phrases that the gospel writers use to describe Jesus' crucifixion over and over again. That connection to Jesus seems even more obvious as we read the next verse, verse 14. "Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals." And what we see in this verse is that the servant will be a person no one expected. He won't be the most popular. He won't be the most likely to succeed. He'll be an outsider from whom no one really expects anything. Of course, the fact that God would choose an unlikely person for this task is not a strange idea in the Bible. Over and over again, even in the Old Testament, we see God choosing the most unlikely people to do his work. Moses was a stutterer. King David started off as a boy, the youngest one in his family. Jacob was a liar, and the list goes on and on like that. God often chose the least likely people to achieve his goals so that it was clear to everyone who really was making things happen, that it was God who was winning the battle. For Christians, this description of one with a marred appearance, barely even human, describes the crucified Jesus. How could anyone be less attractive than a helpless, naked, bleeding man hanging from a cross or a battered corpse? Barely human. So Isaiah goes on in verse 15. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. Whenever words like kingdom or kings or nations are mentioned in Scripture, it's usually a code word for Gentiles. Gentiles, as you may know, was anyone that wasn't Jewish. It was everyone who was outside God's covenant, which would include all of our ancestors too, include us. Israel was, as you know, a little country that was often pushed around by larger countries and empires. And yet Isaiah is saying that this suffering servant would startle and shut the mouths of even the greatest kings. Once again, it's not hard for us to see these words as a prophecy of how much Jesus and his followers would change the world. That a man who was convicted and executed as a state criminal and as a religious heretic would rise from the dead and lead his followers to transform the world from the inside out, one believer at a time, was more than kings and emperors could believe or even imagine. And yet it happened, just as Isaiah said it would. We now jump to Isaiah 53, verse 1. And by the way, if you're a little confused about why this crosses over chapters, the chapter and verse numbers were added much later. They weren't added by Isaiah when they wrote the song. It was added by a later editor who probably didn't catch the fact that this song went past the end of chapter 52. So we're going to begin reading now at Isaiah 53, verse 1. Who has believed what we have heard, Isaiah writes, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Now, as we saw last week, sometimes the voice of who's speaking in a song can change. In this case, the voice changes from God's voice, which is who was speaking earlier, to the voice of the people who stand in awe of the servant's sacrifice. They also acknowledge here the community's failure to recognize the servant and to recognize the servant's holiness. The first question they ask is, who has believed? And the answer, it's kind of a rhetorical question because the answer is no one. No one really saw it coming. Just as no one saw the Savior being born to an unwed mother in Bethlehem, or that the Messiah could be a simple carpenter from the hill country north of Jerusalem. But anyone familiar with the story of the Bible shouldn't have been surprised. Who could believe that a boy could defeat a giant? Who could believe a man with no army could free the people of Israel from Egypt? Right? That's how you know God is the one at work. That is how the arm of the Lord is revealed. And those who see, those whose hearts aren't hardened, believe. Isaiah continues with this description of the suffering servant in chapter 3, verse 2. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Now, there are certain characteristics that we normally associate with powerful leaders. Sometimes people will say, it looks like somebody sent so-and-so from central casting, right? They're physically imposing, tall, strong, handsome. Most of the time they're male. But as we see in the Bible, God can and does choose anyone, even those that no one else might expect. Isaiah compares the servant to a young plant with its root in dry ground. In other words, most people are going to look at that plant and be pretty sure it doesn't have have very good odds for survival. In the same way, someone from a poor or humble background might not seem like the greatest choice for leadership. But again, that's how God prefers to work. As the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 1:25, the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Isaiah continues this description of the suffering servant in verse 3. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Isaiah is telling us that the suffering servant is one who will be rejected by the established world. Those in power won't like him. Those who are traditionally religious will reject him. He won't have an easy life, and he'll struggle, and he'll suffer, and he'll live with others who have experienced that same kind of life. In fact, Isaiah goes so far as to say that the servant will be despised. People will look at him and say, this guy's going nowhere fast, and anyone who chooses to go with him is going nowhere fast. If you saw him walking down the street, you might avert your eyes. You might even cross to the other side. All of the visual and cultural clues that we use to make our judgments about this guy would tell us that he was a loser. Maybe that he was even dangerous. But then Isaiah makes another startling claim. He says, surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. Isaiah is saying that this servant appears to be crushed and broken. But it's not because of anything he's done, but because of our sickness. It isn't his own poverty that has ground him down. It's ours. But we don't see that. All we see is how miserable and unattractive he is. And we assume he's just getting what he deserves. We accounted him stricken, struck down by God. That's what he's saying. In verse 5 we read, but he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him the punishment upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. So Isaiah is repeating what he said in verse 4, but he transforms the language of sickness into the language of sin. The servant is stricken and afflicted, but it's not something he deserves. Rather, it's something we deserve. And it's not about sickness, it's about sin. The sins for which he is being punished are ours, not his. Now, this was a radical idea thousands of years ago, and I think it's still a radical idea today, that somebody can suffer for us, that somebody can take our sin upon himself so that we can be forgiven. It's pretty amazing. Amazing grace. It's about atonement, or as I've heard it described before, at one-ment. Through Jesus' sacrifice, we are reconciled with God. We're made right with God, justified. It's a radical idea, but as Isaiah understood, it's absolutely necessary. Because as he goes on in verse 6, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Isaiah is reminding us that no one gets it right. All of us have gone our own way like sheep without a shepherd. We need someone to step into the breach for us because we can't do it on our own. That image of sheep then comes up again in the next verse when Isaiah reminds us the sheep were used in the temple as an offering to God for forgiveness. It reads, and we read in verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. A sacrificial lamb was defenseless and innocent. That's why it was so easy for the early church to see Jesus as the Lamb of God, who sacrificed his life for the sins of the world. Isaiah says that the suffering servant didn't open his mouth, that he never protested his punishment or defended himself. Again, we see these details in the story of Jesus' own passion, right there in the Gospels. Like I said before, it's very hard not to see Jesus' story in every verse of this song. Now, the suffering servant goes on from there for another 5 verses, and you can read the rest for yourself. Basically, Isaiah kind of repeats some of the themes that he's already addressed, but there's no doubting how important this song is, not only for the Bible, and probably for Jesus' own understanding of who he was, but also because of the impact that it's had on the history of the world. I really hope you'll plan to join me for worship this coming Sunday as I explore this beautiful song even more. Don't forget, we're going to be resuming in-person worship at 9 and 11, and you'll be able to continue to access our online worship on Facebook Live at both of those times, and then afterwards, later. And you can also come and listen to the services on the radio in our parking lot on channel FM 89.7. Thank you for joining me for our online Bible study this week, and I pray that you'll have a great week and that we'll be able to see each other very soon. God bless.